thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. We know it's particularly a busy time in schools and also other settings, and you've probably had a busy day, but I think it's a really important topic, and we've got hopefully some really useful information to help you. So we're going to be looking at the adverse reactions to food and the management of allergens in the classroom, and particularly what are we going to cover? So we're going to look at allergies, intolerances, autoimmune disease, and the impact of these on health. We're going to touch on the most common food allergies or allergens and the most common food intolerances. Thinking about cutting out specific food and food groups and the impact on the diet. This might be something you often get asked by your parents or by your pupils, and just a little bit of advice around that. Allergen labeling, really important that we're passing on the information to the people that we're working with, but also for our own knowledge as well. And then we're going to move on into the actual management of allergens in the classroom. And I'm going to be looking at that at sort of more of a top line management level. We will talk about sort of the nitty gritty of it. And Barbara will do some of that when she talks about the work she's been doing. But this is sort of more the top line side. And then we've got some links to some further information for you. So looking at food hygiene and safety policies and risk assessments, but focusing on allergens particularly, the ways to reduce the harm of allergens, some links to Food Effective Life resources and other resources and support, and some other things that you might find helpful. Okay, I'm now going to pass over to Bridget, and she's going to cover this first part for us. So Bridget, if you let me know when you want me to move on with the slides, I can do so.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Frances, and thanks for having me on to talk about this. Like you said, I think it's a really important topic. So the first question, how many people have food allergies and intolerances? And so I'll be talking about both of these things, food allergies and intolerances, slightly different things. And you'll see that the prevalence of both is slightly different. So this is some findings from a recent project called the Patterns and Prevalence of Adult Food Allergy Report. This was something that was commissioned by the UK Food Standards Agency. And so they looked at a sample of people in the UK, and they found that when they asked people, about 30% of adults reported some kind of adverse reactions to food. So some sort of illness, discomfort, trouble when eating a particular type of food, whether that is an intolerance or an allergy. And when these people were clinically assessed, about 6% of those were estimated to have an actual food allergy, so something that you could diagnose by specific tests. And that's about 2.4 million adults in the UK. So it's a minority, but of course that is a lot of people. So the most common allergies for adults, and this would be different for children, but adult peanuts and tree nuts that are the most likely to cause an allergic reaction. Interestingly, many individuals had allergies to fruits like apple, peach, and kiwi fruit, and there was often some crossover here with birch pollen. So that, for example, hay fever type pollens, and there is that relationship between, sometimes you will find crossover between sort of different nuts. So people who are allergic to one type of tree nuts are often allergic to all tree nuts, and similarly, these fresh fruits seem to have crossover to some of the hay fever pollens. Allergies like milk, fish, shrimp, and mussels were less common. Some childhood allergies do die out in childhood, but some do persist into early adulthood. And then some allergies will come later in adulthood. So there's different patterns for different types of allergens. So this is what we found for adults. Next slide, please, Frances. So for children, about 40% of children in the UK have some kind of allergy. And the four most common are food allergy, which of course is what we're talking about, eczema, asthma, and hay fever. And almost 1 in 12, that's around 8%, young children suffer from some sort of food allergy. And as I mentioned, sometimes children will grow out of these food allergies, things like milk and eggs sometimes will resolve later, but others will persist into adulthood. And that's figures from Allergy UK. Next slide, please, Frances. I just thought it might be interesting to look at a study that was published last year, and that looked at the increase in food allergy. Now, they looked at figures from 2008 up to 2018, and they found that food allergy had doubled in the UK over the last decade. Now, the analysis that they did found rather different results in terms of the percentage of people, but they did see this increase in allergy over that decade, and that's something that we've seen with other types of allergies as well. The other thing this study looked at was that there were worrying trends in terms of people not having access to the right treatments for their allergy. So, for example, the auto-injector pens, which are so important if people do suffer from a severe food allergy, were not always available, and that was particularly related to people in areas of deprivation. So that is a worrying finding, and something that really needs to be looked into more. Next slide, please, Francis. So what are we talking about when we talk about food allergy and intolerance? So food intolerance is broader, essentially, and it can be any difficulty resulting from eating certain foods. It could be an unpleasant reaction. It could be stomach pains, for example. Whereas a food allergy is a specific immune reaction to the ingestion of a food, but that can have different symptoms, but that is typically measured by a prick test, which could be done by a GP or another health professional. Next slide, please, Francis. So there are differences between the two. So food allergy is related to an immune reaction, whereas a food intolerance isn't. For food allergy, symptoms will come on rapidly and can be caused by very small amounts of food, even trace amounts. Whereas an intolerance can come on much later, even hours after eating the food. Food allergy will be very specific, triggered by specific foods or ingredients in them, so peanuts, shellfish, for example. And whereas an intolerance can be broader and caused by different foods. Food allergies can, as you know, be very serious, especially those, for example, with nuts, where you get an anaphylactic reaction, whereas food intolerances are unpleasant but don't tend to be as serious as allergies. Next slide, please. So looking at food intolerances, the kind of symptoms we often see with food intolerance are things like bloating and stomach pain. But of course, it doesn't include things that are caused by viruses or toxins or food aversion. So food intolerance can be quite difficult, actually, to sort of diagnose and treat, because it can be quite general. People suffer from symptoms like irritable bowel syndrome, which can be caused by a variety of different issues. Next slide, please. So testing for food intolerance usually has to be done by eliminating foods. So typically people would do a food diary and log the types of foods that cause symptoms and the types of symptoms that you get. And then you'd cut out the food for 2 to 6 weeks to see if that causes an improvement, and then reintroduce it to see if the intolerance returns. So it's really important that this is done with medical supervision, because cutting out foods or food groups can have serious impacts on your nutrition. So, for example, cutting out dairy. Dairy is a really major source of calcium, iodine, B vitamins in the diet. And so if you're cutting it out, you do need to have medical supervision in place to make sure that those nutrients are being provided by other things in the diet or by supplements. Next slide, please. So one example of a food intolerance is lactose intolerance, and this is caused by a lack of the enzyme that is needed to digest the milk sugar called lactose. And so people will probably have different levels of sensitivity. So for some people, very small amounts of lactose cause pain, whereas for others, they can tolerate a bit of lactose, but not too much. So if you get undigested lactose, that goes into your large intestine, where it causes pain, diarrhea, flatulence, and general discomfort. Lactose intolerance is more common in people from an Asian, African, Caribbean heritage than it in people of European heritage. And it can also come on later in adulthood. So our lactase activity is highest in children and it declines with age. So it can be that this is a type of intolerance that comes on in adulthood rather than in childhood. Next slide, please. Celiac disease is something rather different. So this is an autoimmune reaction to gluten. So this is a protein found in wheat and other cereals. So you'll find it in bread, pasta, and so forth. And it's estimated that about 1 in 100 people have a condition, but that actually it's very underdiagnosed. So only about 36% of the people who have the condition have been clinically diagnosed. And there's no real treatment currently for celiac disease. So people who have this condition have to avoid foods containing gluten throughout their life. And of course, that can be very challenging because wheat is a real staple in this country. Lots and lots of products are made using it. So obviously things like bread and pasta and those kind of products, but also things like sauces. People who have very high sensitivity have to be very careful about foods that are cooked with things that contain gluten. But there are quite a lot more products now that are gluten-free, and that can be consumed by people with celiac disease. Next slide, please. So food allergy then is an allergic reaction, which is essentially the body's immune system reacting to something as if it is dangerous when it's actually not. So most people can eat peanuts, can eat wheat, can eat milk without any issues, but for people with an allergy, their immune system reacts very strongly and causes a range of different symptoms. So allergic reactions can vary in how severe they are. So it can be something that is just uncomfortable, like a rash, but it can also be. So in a food, immune system doesn't recognize the protein in a food, so it's specifically the protein that causes the allergic reaction, and reacts to that as if it is attacking the body. Next slide, please. Just to say, I can see there are a couple of raised hands, but I think the best thing, if possible, is if people could put their questions in the chat and then we can pick those up as we go along. So anaphylaxis, this is a very severe form of allergic reaction. When someone has an anaphylactic reaction, they may have serious symptoms and these can develop very, very quickly. It is rare, but peanuts, for example, can cause anaphylactic reactions, as can tree nuts, and a number of other allergens, including cow's milk, eggs, fish, and soy. Next slide, please. So, of course, it's really important that people with allergies are able to look and check what allergens food contains. So the allergen labelling that we have currently has 14 specific allergens. So these are listed here and they include gluten, celery, crustaceans like crab and shellfish. And apologies, it's not a great picture to demonstrate it, but generally speaking, the allergens in the ingredients list have to be highlighted in some way, and often this is by putting them in bold. So you can see at the bottom right of that picture that gluten is highlighted there. So when you have wheat, for example, you'll have contains gluten by the side of it. On labels, you may also have may contain labelling. So this is where something is not actually an ingredient in the product, but it may be produced in a factory that deals with nuts or wheat, for example, so that it can't be guaranteed free of that ingredient. Wow. Okay, next slide, please. So allergen labelling law. So you're probably all aware of a very tragic case that happened a few years ago now, where a young woman called Natasha Laperouse purchased a baguette. She had a sesame allergy and she didn't realize that the baguette she purchased had sesame seeds, and she had an allergic reaction on a plane and very tragically died. So following on from this tragedy, the government introduced legislation around full ingredient labelling, including allergens, for foods prepared for direct sale. So that would be pre-packed sandwiches and other pre-packed products. So they would be produced in an out-of-home setting like a cafe or a restaurant, but they would be pre-packed, so were packed sandwiches, for example. And you will probably have seen these labels. So you will have on a sandwich that you would buy from a supermarket or a cafe, a full ingredients list, which highlights the allergens that it contains. So this would also apply in schools. So where you've got in a school canteen sandwiches and other food products sold for pre-packed for sale, they would also have to be labelled with all the ingredients and with any allergens highlighted. Next slide, please. Okay, so that's the end of my section, I think. So let me check on any queries. The figure of 36 cases diagnosed. So that's a good question. I don't know, and I probably have to go back to the Allergy UK site to find that out. But I guess essentially, lots of people who report having celiac disease have not been through the diagnosis, which involves having to take something with gluten, and then they would actually look at your gut, and the gut has a specific reaction to gluten, which can be measured by putting a camera into your gut. And that's the sort of clinical diagnosis of how you would get a celiac disease diagnosed. But of course, what we don't want is people self-diagnosing or using, there's a lot of kits and a lot of things that are really not evidence-based that are suggested that people can use to diagnose allergies and intolerances. They are really not based on science, and people really do need to get that proper medical diagnosis for food allergies and intolerances. There's lots of different ways that food allergies and intolerances can be treated and managed, but it is really important that you get medical supervision, because some of these diets, for example, a FODMAP diet, people have come across that for things like irritable bowel syndrome, can be really effective, but they're also very challenging to follow without that support.
That's fantastic, Bridget. Thank you. I was just putting a message in the chat just to say that Bridget's going to be leaving us shortly. She's not had a camera on today because she's got a poorly child at home. But if you've got any questions, if you can pop them in the chat as quickly as possible for Bridget, that would be great. And then we can allow Bridget to leave and look after her poorly child. In the meantime, what we're going to be doing is thinking in a moment about managing allergens in the classroom, and we'll move on to that shortly. So somebody's put on, can you recommend some free training for parents and schools? So at the end of this presentation, which will be shared with everybody, we have got a further sources of information slide, which does actually have a link to a Food Standards Agency free training. It is designed for businesses, but it might be something that would be useful to have a look at, particularly from a school's point of view. How appropriate it is for parents, I'm not sure. And I think you're probably better off going to the different allergy charities. I will be talking also a bit later on about some new resources that have been produced by the Natasha Research Foundation, which is it's called the Allergy School, and that is particularly pertinent to primary schools. And there's probably information for parents on there. So I'll share those links later on. So Rosalie said, what would your advice be for food teachers around does not contain, but maybe in a factory that does? So Bridget, if you're still there, have you got any thoughts on that? Oh, I think maybe Bridget's gone. Okay, that's fine. So what I would say is that we've obviously got to be very, very wary of that. But the problem is, as I'll say later on, is that it's very difficult and really about sort of banning particular ingredients. So we need to be thinking about sort of managing those ingredients, and perhaps if it says on a label that may contain, perhaps that's something that should be avoided in the classroom if you can't guarantee that it's not going to contain a particular allergen. I know that's tricky and it makes things harder, but I think it's just having a wider awareness. Okay, so we're going to move on to the next section now, but that was great to get that information from Bridget. So I think this statement or this fact on here and the data, I think is really quite striking, and it's probably why we're all here today, in that from the Anaphylaxis UK website, it states that 20% of severe allergic reactions to food occur while pupils are in school. So we all know that pupils are with us for a long part of their day, and actually we've got to make sure that we're being very careful about the way we care for them and their environment, but also making sure that we're being as inclusive as possible, and we will cover that as we go along. Okay. So just a little bit of background, really, just thinking generally about good food hygiene and safety practices in school. So we've got a lot of people today from different settings, not just secondary food teachers. So we know we've got some primary and some other settings, but it's really just thinking about why we do these things. And I always used to say this was probably my most important role as a food teacher in schools, was making sure that nobody was ill from anything that I or anybody else did. So in the context of allergens and allergies and intolerances, it's important to make sure that we've got good safety practices to prevent adverse reactions to food. And that includes food poisoning, but also allergic and intolerant reactions. But that's to your pupils, to parents, and also to other staff as well. Wherever you're working, it's also for your own indemnity. You need to make sure that you're doing absolutely everything possible in order to prevent something from happening. Things do happen, sometimes very sadly, but you need to make sure that you're doing everything that you can to prevent it. And that's particularly part of something called due diligence. But also, wonderfully, there's a greater emphasis on healthy eating and practical cookery in the curriculum. And so we need to be doing as many food activities as we can to encourage healthy eating, healthy lifestyles, and for pupils to understand where their food comes from. And with that comes an awareness that we've got to be careful with allergenic ingredients. But I did just want to pull out a couple of things from the inspection frameworks from around the UK. And although it doesn't ever mention anything about allergens or food poisoning specifically, in every single Ofsted inspection framework around the UK, it talks about making sure that pupils are safe. And that's what we're thinking about, is making sure that they are safe, they feel safe and secure, but they're also aware of what's happening around them and what's being done in order for them to be safe. So that's always something to keep in the back of our minds. So if we move on to sort of the practical management of allergens, so food safety policies and risk assessments, why are they necessary? And I was quite surprised actually to find out that carrying out a risk assessment for food activity is not a requirement across all countries of the UK. However, it is strongly advised. It's really important to make sure that you are aware of what the risks are for all of the activities that you're doing, and you're mitigating any of the hazards and therefore any of the problems that might happen. So the other thing as well is that if you are having an inspection and an inspector comes in and does a deep dive in DT, if you are a DT teacher, whether in primary or in secondary, and they come across something which indicates poor allergen management, then that could be considered or noticed in an inspection and drawn to the school's attention. So we're obviously thinking about the safety of the pupils here and the staff and the parents, but also you're thinking about how things are managed in schools and the implications if something goes wrong. So it's important as well that you're thinking about not what only happens in school, but also about the ingredients that are brought into school, and then also the things that they're taken home, so the finished products, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on. So a little bit more about risk assessments. So these are usually available through local authorities, but the thing that we always say, and Barbara would agree with this, I'm sure, is that it's essential that these are adapted and adopted, or adopted and adapted. So you don't just download a risk assessment, maybe from our Food Effective Life website or from CLEAPS or CERC, and you just put it in your folder and say, oh, I've got a risk assessment, that's fine. They must be adapted to your own particular setting, otherwise they're actually worth nothing. So as I said, we've got some on our website, but also in England, Wales and Northern Ireland, the place to go for them would be CLEAPS. And then in Scotland, it's a different service and they're available from CERC. So do have a look. And the majority of schools and nurseries would be members of both of those organisations. It may be through your science department, but have a look and see what access you can get to those risk assessments. Just a little bit about the ones that we've got here, and part of Food A Fact of Life is we've got some information around tasting, setting up a cooking session. We've got an ingredient check letter, because it's really important that you find out about pupils' allergies, intolerances, or any other reason why they shouldn't be handling particular foods. We've got risk assessment, so practical activity or recipe. And then we've also got a basic risk assessment template. So you could use what we've done to create your own risk assessment. And if you work in a primary setting, we had a really great webinar as part of our Teaching Primary Food and Nutrition programme with Maria from CLEAPS, which talks all about risk assessments and other things you need to be thinking about in a primary setting. So I've put the link for that on the slides, but it can be found on the Food A Fact of Life website as well. Just a little bit more about some of the guidance that we've got. It might be new to you about thinking about food hygiene and the safety and the policies you've got to think about. So there's some background information, why it's important, a short guide, and then we've got some more specific example risk assessments. So the links to those are on the presentation. Record keeping, I know this is something that Barbara's really stresses every time she does a food hygiene course, is about how important record keeping is and making sure your records are all up to date. And particularly, I mean, there's a long list of things you need to be doing there, but particularly in the context for today, you need to make sure that you've got a list of pupils' special dietary requirements, especially allergies, and these need to be kept updated. So if you have a change of rotation, change of year group, those you need to make sure that those are up to date. And then particularly to do with allergies and intolerances, how do you go about getting the pupil information? So they could be gathered by your administration staff and then added pupil records or SIMS if you use SIMS. You could gather by departmental staff via letter or ingredient check slip. So we've got an example of one of those that you could use. You could record it on a seating plan. You could record it on exercise books or booklets. So there are different ways of actually making sure that you, but also the other people around the pupils in the classroom, are aware of anything that they need to be concerned about, perhaps. So what does the school need to know, or you need to know? So is it an allergy or an intolerance? If it's an allergy, is it airborne, contact, or ingested? Because that may change what you do and the different restrictions you put in place, or the different things that you do. So I know that Neve mentioned about for somebody is intolerant or allergic to gluten or intolerant to wheat, then they might, and it's airborne, they might need to wear a mask in the classroom. I have an allergy to eggs, and so sometimes I wore a mask in the classroom because it affected me when it was airborne. So those sorts of things that are good to take a note of. And then what, if any, immediate action is needed if there is a problem, and where you can find that within the school. Okay, so this one was always a bit of a thorny issue. A couple of years ago, I haven't seen so much about it recently, but a few years ago, there was quite a lot of conversation around whether schools should ban ingredients. So make an outright ban on eggs or wheat or dairy. But actually, through the research that we did at the time, none of the allergy associations or the unions recommended that ingredients should be banned outright. And particularly from the DFE is concerned, the guidance states that allergy is classed as a medical condition and schools have a duty to support pupils, and they should make reasonable adjustments so that pupils and children can participate fully and safely, and remove the barriers to participating in school life. So it's about making sure that there is a culture of awareness and an effective whole school management approach. So it's not about banning ingredients, it's making sure that there is a really robust system in place in order to make sure that you're mitigating the risks as much as possible, and to make sure that every pupil is included. And particularly from Allergy UK's point of view, simply banning ingredients is not a risk-free solution, because what you will find is that the pupils may be safe from any allergens in school because they think they've been banned, but actually when they go out into the wider world, they won't understand what it is that they need to be careful of, or the pupils won't understand it either, their friends and their peers. So it's really about learning what the risks are and how to mitigate them. I mentioned earlier around the allergy school, which is from the Natasha Allergy Research Foundation. And this is a fantastic research. It's resource. It's free. It's particularly aimed at primary level, and there's information for pupils and also for parents and schools. But I wanted to pick it up at this particular point because it talks about these three main things. So it's empowering schools to really understand about allergies and what they can do to support the pupils in school, about inclusion, so all children should feel safe at school and be able to participate fully, but also to protect pupils. So more awareness will help to keep children with food allergies safe. So it's fantastic that you're with us today, that you're hearing all this information that will help to keep the pupils safe in your settings. At this point, I did just want to mention some guidance documents that we've got at the BNF, which are around the characteristics of good practice in teaching food and nutrition in schools. The example here is for secondary schools, but we do also have one for primary schools and also for teachers of pupils with additional needs. And within each of the documents, there is a particular characteristic. And this one here is around good food hygiene and safety practices. And it's particularly around the measures that staff and learners take to prevent cross-contamination of allergens and the risk of allergic reaction. And this is all of this particular guide, this characteristics guide, is about exemplifying good practice. So if you haven't seen these, I would recommend that you download them and have a read through them and just double check your practice against what is recommended here. And these were developed with the education community across the UK. So it comes from a basis of expertise. So please do have a look and say benchmark what you do against these characteristics of good practice. And then something similar as well, which is around tasting and testing. So we want to make sure that pupils are able to take part in tasting and testing, because that's a really important part of what they're doing, tasting their food, learning how they can make it better, tasting other ingredients, widening their repertoire. But we obviously need to make sure that it is safe. Little bit more about cross-contamination. That's obviously something we've got to be really careful with in schools, and making sure that we're not passing allergens from sort of one product to another, or from one piece of equipment to another. And it's often happens through poor cleaning of utensils or cross contact during preparation. So just a couple of things on here about separating utensils and having separate areas when preparing and cooking foods containing allergens, and also making sure that everything is really clearly labelled with allergen information. And there's some information, some links on there to the Food Standards Agency with some further information on there that will help you. And also a link to the webinar that I was talking about that Niamh did for us a little while ago, Successful Gluten-Free Cooking in Schools. And that will give you some really sort of hands-on tips about the kind of things that you can be doing in order to prevent cross-contamination and then any further problems after that. Making staff and pupils aware of allergens. I came across this notice board in a school a few years ago, and I just thought it was absolutely fantastic. So what the technician had done is they had taken a document or a chart from the Food Standards Agency, which has got the images on and the names of each of the allergens, and they had had it printed onto a whiteboard. And then what happens at the beginning of the day or the week, the technician puts the directed ingredients or the directed recipes on there. So this doesn't come down to what the pupils are bringing in to make their own recipes, perhaps in year 10 and 11. This is what the teacher is telling them that they're going to make. And they will then identify on this board what the allergens are in those particular recipes. And I thought that was a really nice way of making it really clear to make it clear to the teachers, to the pupils and everybody. So people take a little bit of ownership. So they come in, they have a look and they're aware of what's happening. So that's available, that chart on the website, if you wanted to do that kind of thing. And then there's just a couple of activities, because we always like to share some Food Effective Life activities when we do these webinars. And these are sort of all a similar sort of things. So it's identifying in the dishes the kind of allergens that might be present. And those of you doing hospitality and catering, there's a chef's planner on the screen, which will also help to identify the allergens in the recipes that pupils are making. I mentioned earlier on about labels for finished dishes. So this is something that we started doing a few years ago, providing labels. And this is something I did when I was teaching. And I think it's really important to remember that you need to make sure that you're passing on information to the pupils and parents and carers after the pupils leave your care in school. And a really good way of doing that is just creating a label that can be stuck on the paper bag or on the tinfoil dish, on the plastic container. And it has information like name, date, form, etc. And it has the information around reheating or cooking or storage of the product, because that's obviously very important from a food hygiene point of view. But also it has allergens on there as well, so that everybody is aware of what's contained in that particular dish. And we do have some examples of food labels on the website, which are easily editable, and you can use those for your dishes. So I would, at the beginning of the rotation, if you're making regular dishes, I would print them all off on sticky labels. You've got them, so they're ready there for you to put onto the dishes when you need them. Just a couple of more allergy resources. So we've got planners, some allergy labeling activities, some more understanding allergens. There's different tasks about identifying the allergens in recipes. We've got a PowerPoint presentation, which is adverse reactions to food. And that is similar to the information that Bridget gave you earlier on. So you can pass that on to the pupils. And then we've got a worksheet that goes alongside that PowerPoint presentation as well. And then there's a quiz. These are all 11 to 14 resources, but we have them for primary age, and we also have them for 14 to 16 as well. And there's some supplementary sheet thinking about the additional information that goes on a food label. We've also got our knowledge organisers, and we have a knowledge organiser which is available for every topic that we feel that should be taught across the curriculum, and they go right from primary right to age 16, and each one for each age group has got something around allergens as well. So planning what to cook particularly, and then also food labelling as well. Right, so now it's an opportunity for Barbara to join us, and then Barbara can let us know about the fantastic work that she and Louise at the Food Teacher Centre have been doing around allergies. So thanks, Barbara.
Thank you, Frances. And you just want to sort of reinforce what Frances has been saying about the allergens and what have you in schools. It's a difficult one. But we've been working at the Food Teachers Centre with the Benedict Blythe Foundation. And I work with Helen Benedict, whose son Benedict, Helen Blythe, whose son Benedict sadly passed away from anaphylaxis shock. He had multiple allergies. And we came up with this checklist, which it reinforces the inclusion of children and raising the awareness of how children can do food safely in a lesson, and their peers can appreciate the allergies that they have. So the checklist outlines good practice, and it should be implemented by senior leaders. This goes right to the top. It's head teachers and school governors who, you know, are legally required to accommodate the students, but it's often left to the food teacher or the teacher who is delivering food. So at the Food Teacher Centre, you know, we were very happy to support this initiative. So the checklist is downloadable, and there's lots of great information on their website. It covers things like staff training and school policies. So what should be done. There is very little staff training available, as Francis mentioned. There are online training sessions, but you know, it is difficult to access some of them. Another section that it covers is about lesson planning and risk assessments, which Francis has already mentioned, and the equipment and the environment, because for the children who have allergies, it's good practice to provide clean equipment for them, and clothing and a workspace that hasn't been used by other students. So, you know, just a basic sort of plastic box with a set of equipment in it. Aprons that are only used for the children who have allergens, and they're washed thoroughly at the end. Pupil preparation. So things like peer safety, so that, you know, their peers can appreciate, they can understand the allergy, and they don't create any difficulties in the classroom. And the foods to be eaten, again, already been mentioned, you know, about tasting and testing, but also taking food home, and the labels are so important. And then the wider support, because it's all well and good us doing it in the food room, but, you know, we do need the support from senior management and from heads of department if it's not the food teacher. So I would recommend that, you know, you do have a look on the Benedict Blythe Foundation website, have a look at the checklist, download it, share it with your head teacher, share it with the chair of governors, and get them on board, because it's so important. Thank you. Thank you, Francis.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Barbara. And do stay with us, please, because there might be some questions for you. I know
Will do.
there's some things coming up in the chat, so there might be some for you. But also, Barbara, before you go, although we're talking about from a secondary point of view, perhaps, because you were mentioning food rooms, this is still very relevant for primary, isn't it?
For primary,
So, yeah.
yes. Even if you've got equipment boxes and plastic white clean tablecloths, you can still do it, yes.
Yeah. That's great. And I suppose also for other settings as well, because we know that food doesn't only take place in a school setting.
No.
Yeah,
No.
so that's great. So so I think it's brilliant. So I would thoroughly recommend everybody has a look at this, no matter what your setting. So thank you, Barbara. That's absolutely great. Right, okay. Just a couple more things from me before we see what the questions are. So this is just a list. It's not exhaustive, but a list of some of the support that you might find useful for you. So the links will take you to websites and other resources that will be hopefully helpful if you want to do a little bit more around this. Just a little bit about additional training, some of it which links in to to what we've been talking about today. So we've talked about food spoilage, hygiene and safety. So within that, there is something around allergens and allergenic ingredients. It's not so much about the management side of it, but about the sort of the theory and understanding from your point of view. But the characteristics of teaching food nutrition education, those documents that I mentioned, which exemplify good practice, we do have free online courses based on those. So if you wanted to have a look at those, they are available on the website. And I have mentioned it a couple of times, but there is a webinar recording from Neve around successful gluten-free cooking in schools, and a presentation that goes with that. Okay, I think I'll keep you up to date. So just a little bit of a plug for our education news. If you want to know a little bit more about anything that we're up to, training, etc., please do sign up for our education news newsletter. You'll find the sign up for that on the homepage of the Food Effective Life website. We also have a PPD newsletter, so that's our training newsletter. That's a bit more ad hoc, that's sort of as and when, but if you want to know specifically about training, you could sign up for that. We have got a Twitter page, or X, I should say, so if you'd like to join us on that. And then also we have a specific education inbox as far as emails. So if you can't remember my name or anybody of my colleagues, you could get in contact with us through education@nutrition.org.uk. And then, as I mentioned earlier on, there is the evaluation. It'd be really helpful if you could complete the evaluation for us, because it's important for us to know what you've enjoyed about today, what you've learnt from today, but also if there's anything that we could have improved or what we could do for you in the future, no matter what your setting is. So I think probably what we'll do now, Barbara, is very quickly have a look at the questions and see if there's anything for us. I don't know whether Neve's with us. Are you with us, Neve? I haven't seen her pop up. No.
I am sorry.
Oh, you are. Hi, Neve.
I'm here in the background. How are you?
Excellent. I'm very well,
Hi.
thank you. Brilliant. Thank you for joining us.
No
I
problem.
don't know if you've had a chance to have a look through the questions, either you or
Yeah, I
Barbara.
spotted one earlier there. I think I replied to the girl mentioning about a child with a foodborne reaction to wheat flour. So I would be the same in my case. I'm not celiac, but non-celiac gluten intolerant. So what I do myself is I wear the mask, just the mask we would have worn over COVID, a good dust mask, and I ventilate the room very well. So doors open, windows open, as much ventilation as you can. So that's what I would say on that one. And I see another thing popping up there as regards a lady who doesn't have a food technician and can't account for ensuring that there's no allergens in the room after 3 or 4 cookery classes, maybe in a day. So what I would say to that is, and this is coming from ROI, I suppose, as opposed to UK based, but to some extent, students and parents have to take accountability. Teachers can't guarantee that an airborne allergy, food allergy, is going to be, that the home economics room is going to be a safe space for them. So I think once all of the information is shared with the parents and the student prior to them choosing the subject, in our case, that's what we do in the case of an airborne.
Okay, that's really
I agree with Neve. I think that communication with the parents and carers is crucial, because they live with it 24 hours a day. And so their expertise is crucial. And with regard to the technician, because I can't plug the Food Teachers Centre, but there is lots of information there on the Food Teachers Centre about bidding for technician time and what have you. And it is important. It is important.
Great, thank you. There was one question that I saw about food hygiene training. It might surprise you, but it's actually not a legal requirement for anybody that teaches food to have food hygiene training. I personally think that's wrong, and I think Barbara would probably agree with me with that.
Definitely. It is one of the standards, but
it is.
It came from the Public Health England and British Nutrition Foundation.
Yeah, it is. You're absolutely right. But saying it's not a legal requirement, I think both Barbara and ourselves at BNF would thoroughly recommend that people have food hygiene training. And then after you've done that. So even if it's one person within the school, so if we're talking about a primary school, which I think the question was, you can then cascade that information down to your colleagues. So it's really important that somebody in the school is aware of what you should be doing around food hygiene, safety and allergens, etc. So do look into that if it's not something that you're doing currently. So let's have a look. Is there a possibility I could get the hold of an allergen chart for my classroom? You will find the allergen chart that I mentioned on the Food Standards Agency website, and there is a link to that actually on the slide. So hopefully you'll be able to find that. Just to add for the table, it's an idea to add a cross or other mark of the allergen is absent to make it clear that it's been checked for and not overlooked. Okay, that's useful. Thank you. Thank you very much for that addition to that. Equipment I can see as easy to do, but when we have one food room with 24 children, and this is very difficult, as I've had today, I've had 4 practical lessons and I don't have a technician to help me clean and sort it out. So I think this is what Barbara and...
Yeah, it's just one box. It could be, you know, you may have 1 or 2 children in a lesson who requires the equipment. And yes, they have to wash it up. They don't get out of that job, but you know, it's always good to have somebody who can give it a thorough wash afterwards. So it might not be needed every lesson. It's just a box that you keep away with equipment in that nobody else uses.
And then outside that, I suppose, to just, as you said earlier, Barbara, to make sure that the parents and the child are communicated with and know that teachers can only do what they can do. And outside of that, although we take every single precaution we can, outside of that, there could still be a risk if kids have been cooking there earlier with flour or nuts or whatever the case may be. So yeah, I think what Barbara's saying is the better, have your equipment ready to go and everything sorted, but there has to be accountability on the part of parents and children as well.
Absolutely. There's a question here about, will Food Effective Life be getting any healthy allergy recipes? We're actually going through a review and a refresh of our recipes at the moment, and it's certainly something I'm going to be speaking to Niamh about shortly to see whether we can do something with Niamh around gluten-free recipes, which I think would be great. Yes, that's certainly something that we're going to add to our list. So thank you, Seth, for mentioning that. Okay, so we've got one question here. I work with a school which has one class with many children with severe allergies. They do not want to take risks, so no one from that class is able to cook. Any advice on that? This is a primary school. The class is reception class, but as they progress to year 6, this is an issue. That's a really tricky one, isn't it? I mean, Niamh and Barbara, I don't know if you've got any advice for that. I know this is a primary setting, so
yeah, it is.
Sorry, Barbara, you go on.
No, go on.
No, all that came to my head is the likes of Becky Excel, and I know I'm a gluten-free kind of focus, but a lot of her recipes, she says how you can adapt it for egg-free and nut-free. So if you had a good source of recipes like that, where the author can adapt or makes exceptions for people with different allergies, you might be able to, you know, find something that would work for the majority. So I'd recommend checking out Becky Excel, and there's another girl called the Loopy Whisk. So both of them have recipes that say how to make egg-free, how to make gluten-free, how to make nut-free as well. So that might hit a lot of your major allergens, and hopefully you'll find some that kind of work for every child. That would be the only advice I can think of. Thanks, Niamh. Barbara, was there anything you wanted to add to that?
No, I was just looking at another question that had come up about having a different box for every allergy. No, just have a box with 2 or 3, you know, sets of equipment in them.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and I know the purple equipment has come out, but it doesn't seem to be, you know, as, I don't know, as popular. Some schools have it, some schools don't. It's a bit ad hoc, the purple equipment for allergies.
Yep. And I think probably it's more expensive as well.
I would think so.
Yes. Just one point about the primary school that's not wanting to cook with that one particular class, I know it's a risk, but if the teacher is still online, I definitely have a look at the Allergy School resources from the Natasha Research Foundation, because that's particularly designed for primary, and there might be support on there for you, because I think they would definitely say that if you can, it would be far better to be able to accommodate the pupils within the class so that everybody is included and takes part in something, because they're going to come across these allergies or the allergens elsewhere in their lives, and they need to know what to do and how to control it and how to be safe. I know that's easy, me sitting here saying that, and it's different when you're actually doing it and you're with the class, but it is something, if you can make it inclusive, I think it is really recommended. Okay, right. I think that's probably all of the questions. So just want to say thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. I really appreciate it. I think we all recognise it is such an important topic, and it's very important for us to do the best we can in order to support pupils in our care, but also the parents, the teachers, and other people that you're working with. So thank you, Barbara, for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Frances.
Thank you, Niamh, as well. I know you've been teaching today as well, so
Thank you.
rushed in. So
No problem. Thanks a million for having me.
thank you very much.